Thank you so much for joining us. In the op-ed which you wrote with Mr. Gates, you are calling to provide Ukraine with more powerful and more weapons. Many in US, including a lot of Republicans, consider that US is already assisting Ukraine too much. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that we are assisting Ukraine a great deal, and we have actually appropriated the monies through Congress to assist even more. This is really more a call for urgency about it, that we need to get Ukraine the tools that it needs so that it can continue to push back the Russian aggressor. In fact, we could have, let me just give you an example, we probably could have predicted months ago that Ukraine was going to need air defenses because the only thing left to Vladimir Putin was to use terrorist tactics and have missile attacks against Ukrainian civilian centers. We could have predicted that. So let's be ahead of the curve and get Ukraine what it needs. And the other thing that I would say is the United States has to remember that every time we've waited, 1914, 1941, 2001, we've always had to enter. And this time around, no one is asking for our troops. The Ukrainians are willing to fight. They're willing to suffer in order to sustain an international system in which it is not acceptable to extinguish your smaller neighbor by military force. That's what is at stake here. And America has a tremendous interest in sending a lesson to the Russians that that is not going to be allowed.
One of the main arguments against that option is that it can provoke Putin, it can escalate, including the nuclear option. What would you say to this argument?
Well, I don't know how much more you can provoke Putin. He's tried to extinguish his neighbor. He's engaged in terrorist tactics. They are engaged in war crimes. When I hear people say you might provoke Putin, I think, what more is there to do? And when you think about the nuclear option, I really don't, it's not a zero possibility, but I think that Putin does care, oddly enough, about his international standing. To do that would make Russia a large North Korea, a pariah state for the future. And Putin has been warned not just by us, but he's been warned by the Indians, by the Chinese, that the nuclear option shouldn't even be considered. And so we cannot deter ourselves and the Ukrainians by trying to deter something that I think is unlikely.
There's certainly, so on certain level, there is a push on Ukraine, not on the official US level, but a certain level push on Ukraine to start negotiating with Russia at this point. You seem to be thinking of them otherwise.
Yes, negotiations, diplomacy follows the situation on the ground, not the other way around. And so we need to make sure that when there are negotiations, and there will eventually be, that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position, and that isn't now. We are seeing that the Russians are making a push again in Donetsk. Vladimir Putin declared Donetsk and Luhansk to be Russian territory. He can't negotiate away Russian territory. So to ask for negotiations now is, first of all, probably going to be fruitless, and to possibly leave the Russians in a better position than they would otherwise be if we allow the Ukrainians to push them back further. I would be the last person to say when negotiations should begin. I think we have to say that the Ukrainian people who've suffered war crimes, who've suffered the destruction of their territory, who have seen Ukrainian citizens taken away by the Russians, to tell them negotiate now seems to me not something that we can defend as Americans. Right now, our job is to help Ukraine, to help us to reestablish that, and that the kind of thing that the Russians did is simply not going to succeed in the world of 2023. If you look at those pictures, they look like they're from 1939. We did this once, and it didn't turn out so well. So let's make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to fight our fight.
You knew, and you met Putin personally. You knew him quite well. in your opinion now, is he a rational actor? I mean, can he even engage in rational dialogue, or is he already beyond that point?
Well, he's rational in the sense that he understands what he's trying to do, and we've seen shifting Russian priorities. You know, at first it was to go to Kyiv and overthrow the Ukrainian government, and then it sort of dialed back to the east and the south. And when that wasn't really, you know, to cut off Ukraine at Odessa, when that wasn't possible, they've moved back again. So I think he's rational, but to be rational doesn't mean that you don't have ambitions that are ideological, that are emotional. And there, I think this is about reconstructing the Russian Empire. And you can't have an independent Ukraine and reconstruct the Russian Empire. And so there's something deeply emotional about this for Putin. That doesn't mean irrational, but it does mean that it is something deeply emotional and perhaps right now not negotiable in his way of thinking. And so you have to help Ukraine, let him see that it's not going to be possible, that no matter how much he would like to achieve that, it's not going to happen. And then we'll see whether rationality takes over.
You were state secretary in 2008 during the Bucharest summit when Georgia and Ukraine were denied membership action plan. It did not happen. In retrospect, do you think that was a mistake?
Well, we in the Bush administration argued for Ukraine and Georgia to have MAP at the Bucharest summit. But NATO is a consensus organization, and the consensus was not there. And so we did the next best thing, which was to express that one day Ukraine and Georgia would be a part of NATO. I don't like leaving a vacuum in international politics. And when you think about it, geographically, we have protected Poland and Romania and others on the periphery of Ukraine because they have an Article 5 guarantee from the United States. And by not even giving Ukraine a pathway to NATO membership, perhaps that left a vacuum. I think now, with the bravery of the Ukrainians, one thing that Vladimir Putin has done is he's actually driven Ukraine closer to NATO, not as a member, but as a beneficiary of everything NATO can provide short of troops. He has, someone said, Vladimir Putin has managed to end German pacifism and Swedish neutrality all within a year. I think we are going to see a NATO with Sweden and Finland as members. I would never have dreamed of this when we were there in 2008. So it has come at great cost to the Ukrainian people, and I don't want to minimize that. But when we succeed in helping Ukraine to repel the Russian aggression, whatever that means, whatever that final settlement is, we will have changed the face of Europe for the better. And for that, we have the Ukrainian people to thank.
What about now? Would you still argue for NATO to accept Ukraine even before the hostilities over?
I think it is difficult to do that because it comes with a guarantee that I would not want to test, frankly, and give Putin a kind of moral victory if you set off discussions in NATO about what does it mean and so forth. I think where we are now, if we are, as Bob Gates and I argued, fully committed to Ukraine's defense through what we can provide so that the Ukrainians can defend themselves, that's where we need to be. Now, the time will come when I think, and President Zelensky has said this, when we have to think about how to secure Ukraine in the future, what kinds of security guarantees there need to be. But I think that is for another time. Let's do everything that we can right now to repel the aggression and to do it with a sense of urgency so that when we get to the period of reconstruction after the war, Ukraine is in a stronger position.
There seems to be a good consensus between Ukrainian and US administration about how the Ukrainian victory would look like. It's restoring Ukrainian sovereignty and holding Russia responsible for its action. But how would the Russian defeat look like?
Well, I don't want to talk about the Russian defeat. I'm hoping that there is, from the Russian perspective, an understanding that they already have not achieved their goals. In that sense, they've already achieved, there's already been a defeat. You know, people were talking about Kyiv falling in 5 days. We know that the Russians went with their dress uniforms for the parade in Kyiv. So much has already been accomplished when it comes to what Russian goals initially were. Now it's the Russian goal of hanging on to territory that they illegally annexed. That's the next goal that we need to have with pushing the Russians back from their intended ambitions. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But I think if we focus on the task at hand right now, it is to make sure that they cannot secure illegally the annexed territory. And that's the battle that's going on in Donetsk as we speak. That will be the battle for the South. But and by the way, they also didn't succeed in the South, which they had intended to. You know, Kherson is under attack, but it's free. And so in a war, it's good to keep the long-term goals in mind, but it's more important to win the short-term goals as you move forward.
You made 2 more questions. Should U.S. administration, expert community, to even prepare for eventual and possible or not possible Russia rapture? So not to repeat the situation in 1991.
I'm sorry for it. I didn't understand.
For the possible rapture of Russia, the Russian collapse, the Russian breaking.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Well, no, there's no doubt that you know, we ought to be planning for all contingencies. But I'm still hopeful that a time will come when a different Russia can emerge. There were signs of it. A lot of those people left Russia when this started. Young entrepreneurs, people who wanted to be part of the knowledge-based revolution. Tatiana, I taught some of these Russians in my classes at Stanford. And so there will be a different Russia one day. And hopefully it will come about peacefully.
Go back to this 2008, the fateful year. Do you believe that the response to Putin's aggression in Georgia should have been much stronger? And then again in 2014 in Ukraine. So is there anything you would blame the Bush administration or the subsequent Obama administration for creating the condition for Putin to go on full-scale invasion?
Well, I don't know what more we could have done about Georgia. Frankly, I believe we stopped the Russian ambition to take Tbilisi. They clearly wanted to overthrow Saakashvili. And let me use this as an opportunity to appeal to Georgia on behalf of Misha Saakashvili, who is ill, who is under arrest. He is a man who I would hope we would understand his historical role and the humanitarian circumstances there. But I think we did stop them from Tbilisi. Georgia remained an independent country. Yes, the territories of Abkhazia and Ossetia, Russia was able to seize, but frankly, unfortunately, they were already there as peacekeepers, which I think was a mistake much earlier. As to Crimea, and I would have liked to have seen stronger sanctions after Georgia, but of course we got into the financial crisis and there were other issues in the economy. Crimea, perhaps there could have been stronger sanctions. The one thing that I will say about Crimea is I do think we used, we and the Ukrainians, and here I mean Europe, the United States and the Ukrainians, used the time between the annexation of Crimea and now to build a very impressive Ukrainian defense force. The Ukrainian military fights like a modern military. They fight with deception and maneuver. And it's part of the reason the Russians are having such trouble. They fight like a 20th, 19th century force. And so I think Ukraine got stronger after the annexation of Crimea. I think Ukraine started to heal some of its internal conflicts and clearly a strong sense of Ukrainian national identity, even with those in the East, emerged. And so while I would have hoped we would have done more, that time was not lost.
But were you surprised by the Ukrainian response? And if anything you want to say to Ukrainians directly?
Um, Everyone was surprised by the Ukrainian capability, maybe not by the response. I've been in Kyiv many times. I've been in other parts of Ukraine. I know how strong the identity is of the Ukrainian people. I know how much they love their language, which is very different than the Russian language. I tell people I speak very good Russian. I can make mistakes in Ukrainian because they're not the same language. And so, yes, I know all of that. But you had to marvel at the unity of the country, the willingness to sacrifice, the skill of the Ukrainian forces. And so I would say to the Ukrainian people, thank you. Thank you for standing up for the principles and values that we have espoused for all of these years of individual liberty, of freedom, of the right to determine one's own future. And America, I believe, is with you. Americans, I believe, are with you. And I'm just so grateful that Ukrainians have responded in the way that they have. And it's very tough, and it will undoubtedly continue to be tough. But I hope that the Ukrainian people also believe, as I do, that we will be there with you when the aggressor has been repelled and it's time to rebuild.